Are you dreaming about travelling again? I bet you are. So give yourself a break and listen to my brand new travel podcast. It's made for people like you, by people like you. And in these podcasts, there will be interviews with different types of travellers and the strange characters that I've met on the road, with stories and anecdotes from the last 32 years of my continuous backpacking and working around the world. Also, there'll be cynical destination descriptions and the occasional travel tip to smooth your journey. And for all the squeamish listeners out there, I just want to say that no studio was used or abused in the making of these podcasts or any of the recordings. So please check it out, and I hope you like it.
I threw my backpack into the tuk-tuk, jumped in alongside it, and asked the driver to take me to the port. It was the same old port. It was even busier, even noisier, and even smellier than the last time I was down there. And the driver made a fuss. Even though I knew which was my boat, he made a fuss asking everybody which was the boat to Tabatinga. Obviously he was looking for a tip, but he was just making a fuss of finding my boat, which I knew already. On the first deck, the hammocks were in 2 rows. In the end, there was probably about 150 hammocks in there. But there was 2 rows, and down the middle of the rows were posts, every so often. And at the top of the posts were sockets, plug sockets, so you could charge your phone. So I set my hammock up. I padlocked my backpack to the post, and then I went up to the platform by the bridge and watched the supplies being loaded as I did before on the other boat. And it was all the usual stuff. Sacks of onions, stacks and stacks of soft drinks. There were planks of wood, bags of cement, and these massive fiberglass water tanks, brand new water tanks, and a brand new tuk-tuk to be delivered somewhere. And then slowly the passengers started to arrive. This time there were more foreign backpackers coming aboard. There was possibly about 8 or 9 in the end, where most of the other backpackers, the foreign backpackers, were on the upper deck, which was the one above us, which was more open to the elements. It was it wasn't the same setup as my deck. And of course, with a more open setup, you've got chill night breezes coming through, possibly more mosquitoes. It was just open to the elements. Could be open to the rain if we hit a storm at night. You pays your money and you takes your choice. And at about 3 or 4 o'clock it could get very, very cold. I mean, it really could get quite cold. So you had to be prepared to wrap up or to have a partner to cuddle at night. On our deck we were all packed in like sardines again. And of course when it's a hot and humid night, it's quite warm and quite personal. It can be quite amazing that there's 150 people all sleeping in hammocks. And from my deck there was the upper deck, and then there was the top deck. In the top deck I would be scanning the river to see if I could see any pink dolphins, which was still eluding me. This boat was more or less the same size as the last boat, but also they had fresh water tanks up there. So now the showers and the water for the toilets and the sinks was all clean fresh water, so it'll make things like showering and shaving easier, even though it's cold water, not like the first boat which was river water. And we set sail just as the sun was setting, and we got to the first village in the dark, and the people were there waiting as the porters unloaded all the supplies, and then the boat just backed out into the river and back on its way again. And we seemed to stop at every little tiny village and settlement on our way down the river, which was really lovely because you get to see and understand how these villages and small towns work. And always, whatever time you stopped, day or night, there were people waiting for the boat to turn up. And sometimes there were religious compounds. They'd all come out and carry the supplies back. And again, the small villages were the basic palm huts, and the others were just like, some were wooden brick villages, but again, right on the edge of the river. The next day I was actually lucky to see a family of giant otters on the riverbank as we made our way down the river. But I didn't realise just how big they were. They've got to be 3 or 4 times the size of a European otter. Amazing, there's half a dozen of them. Just great to see whole families. The days and nights then were hot and humid when we started off, and the hammocks were all squashed in tighter than sardines in a can. And as I say, the upper deck had the foreign backpackers on it, which was more open to the elements. While I was on the top deck the next day scanning the river for these elusive pink dolphins, I was trying to keep an eye on the riverbank and the edge of the jungle as well for the wildlife. You see birds and monkeys and things around, as I said in the last episode, but you're always keyed up to see something special if you can. And while I was up there, I got chatting to an Aussie backpacker, a guy called Ben Ferris, and his French girlfriend. They were travelling to Leticia in Colombia, where the 3 borders come together. You got Peru, Colombia and Brazil all coming together. And Ben was a real character. And I noticed him because he was shirtless and he had a map of the world tattooed on his back. And it seemed that he was having the countries filled in that he visited. So that was pretty unique. And he told me how he'd run multiple marathons, some in barefoot, some in flip-flops, and sometimes not wearing many clothes other than budgie smugglers. And if you don't know what budgie smugglers are, look it up on the internet. Write in budgie smugglers. And Ben was a real character. Check him out. He's a crazy guy, and he's very passionate about what he does, and all in the name of good environmental causes, and does a lot of work with children, I think. And the reason he got the nickname Ferris Gump, because he looks a lot like the Tom Hanks character in the movie Forrest Gump, where he runs across America with all the wild hair and the wild beard. He ran round Australia, in flip-flops or something like that. He does some crazy stunts to get money for charity and environmental causes. And this journey I was taking down the river was in February, which is the rainy season when massive storms are common in the Amazon. You saw them on a daily basis all over the place, from different parts of the horizon right through to close by, and even sometimes we'd get hit by a storm. And you could watch the clouds gather and build into an enormous powerful storm that developed off in a distance, but as you followed the river, the storm either caught you or you were caught by the storm. You don't realise how massive these storms are. The storms we have, or we normally see, are nothing compared to what was happening there. And then it unleashes its ferocity onto the jungle, just dumping all the rain. And of course, after that, the river swells. You can visually see it. It's flowing faster after a storm. And it also carries whole trees that have been knocked off the banks into the river. And so these trees, we're talking massive trees. Some of the trees 40 or 50 metres high. And there's tree trunks and branches all being washed down the river. I'm sure they watch out on the boat to try and avoid the worst stuff. But the river is just a mass of trees and branches after a storm. And then one calm, balmy night, I was woken because the regular hum of the engine stopped. So did the boat. And it was about 3:15 a.m. in the middle of the night. And I just assumed that they were unloading illicit goods, drugs or something like that, or worse. Maybe taking on drugs. So I quietly slipped unnoticed away from the 150-odd passengers on my deck who were sleeping, making sure that I didn't snag or bump into any other hammocks on the way. Everybody was asleep except me. And the quiet sound of so many people breathing while they're asleep was sort of comforting in a strange way. You just don't realise that just that number of people would make that sort of noise. It's just breathing. And I went quietly up the metal stairs to the bridge platform. But before I stepped out, I could see that outside was pitch black, and I could see stars before I actually stepped through the doorway onto the platform. But as I came round the corner to the front of the boat, it was all lit up. There was this wide, powerful spotlight dancing on the surface of the river. We were stationary in the middle of the river as porters, and 3 indigenous natives with 3 canoes manhandled a huge fiberglass water tank over the side and onto one of the narrow canoes alongside the boat. It was almost comical, with an enormous tank resting precariously along this narrow canoe. And as the crew members, the porters, wrestled to get it over the side and down to the other canoe, the strangest thing happened. Behind the men, 2 curious pink dolphins popped their heads up to see what the commotion was. Or maybe they thought it was just the light of the moon on the water. And they just were there bobbing around, disappearing and reappearing on the other side and checking out what these guys were doing in the canoes. It was amazing to see these elusive creatures. And I quickly looked around to see if anybody else had seen it too. But no, there was nobody else there. I was on my own. And it was a real surreal serendipity moment. One of those small moments that I cherish when travelling. And for me, it's all about those minute moments. And I'd spent days searching the river in the scorching sun on the top deck to see these dolphins. And then I saw them when I least expected it. And after the dolphins slipped away for the last time, I watched the crew manhandle the last tank over the side of the boat and onto the 3rd canoe. And then I quietly returned to my hammock, and no one else was the wiser, feeling really privileged and content. And the motor on the boat started up, and we started moving again. A couple of days later, I was standing on the platform underneath the bridge this time, looking down the river, when a local Peruvian man started talking to me. Now, my Spanish isn't that good, but I soon understood this conversation was getting weird. He told me about the legend of the pink dolphins. I hadn't mentioned anything about the pink dolphins. And then after hearing his story, I thought he must be crazy. Nobody would ever believe this stuff. And the story is that if a village girl gets pregnant, it's blamed on the pink dolphins. And it's the same if a female gets raped, he told me. Then there's the magical fish story. Apparently it's the size of a boat, a big boat. And it's magical. I just put it down to tall stories. And they all believe them. And I've had this confirmed by an American guy I know called Eric who lived in the Amazon, and he said they have stories about all the animals in the jungle and in the rivers. When we pull into a jetty or a quay now, because the towns and villages are bigger, locals laden with pre-cooked food surge on board to sell us these delicacies and the food they've cooked. And they flood their way through the ship, and they have it timed perfectly, so if the boat's staying for 10 minutes, they can come on, sell their food, and get off. If the boat's staying for 5 minutes, they'll be the same. And if they run out of food, they have people on the quay with more food to come on. And they have every type of food, from chicken and rice to fruit. So yeah, they've got it timed, they've got it really off to a T. And the food is good. And in some of the larger villages that we stopped at, and if we had time to spare, I'd go ashore and grab something to eat, or I'd buy something to eat back on board if time was short. It all depended, because at the moment these boats weren't serving food, where the next boats in Brazil were. And as a seasoned traveller, it's so easy to start a casual conversation with a complete stranger. By now I'd met most of the backpackers on board. And it's the same in the backpacker hostels and guest houses we stay at around the world. So yes, as I say, as a seasoned traveller, it becomes easy to start a casual conversation with a complete stranger. And you learn some good things from some people. And one of the backpacking girls actually was ill. She had an upset stomach, obviously had diarrhoea. But none of us had any antibiotics left or with us. So when we stopped at the next big Amazon town, Cocha, we were staying for a couple of hours or more. So we all made plans to go ashore. And so the girl could buy her antibiotics and we'd get a few drinks. We docked around 7 o'clock. It was a nice evening. And that's where this new tuk-tuk was being delivered. And when I came down the gangplank, I actually saw the crew having problems getting the tuk-tuk off the boat, and a bit later on getting it up the stairs to the street. It was being a problem, but they had 2 or 3 hours to do it, so it wasn't too bad. And on my way down the stairs, by the river's edge, I saw a man gutting a dead pig and throwing what he didn't want into the river. Then he washed the carcass with river water to clean it, as 6 small kids watched on. And just behind him was a cockerel tied by its leg to a table. So maybe I thought that was the next thing to be on the chopping block. And we were a group of 6 people and a small child. The small child belonged to the young Argentinian couple. There was the Aussie guy, Ben, and his girlfriend, another girl and myself. We first stopped at the pharmacy to buy some antibiotics for her upset stomach. And then we walked across the plaza to a bar where some of us sat down and had drinks. But as we walked across the square, and the square was busy, it's sort of like early evening, and there were lots of people, especially young people, there were lots of people around. The usual little group of old people talking amongst themselves. Nobody stared, nobody was watching us, they just carried on as normal, which told me that this town was used to having tourists around, because we were nothing out of the ordinary. So yeah, they weren't too worried about foreigners. I've been to some places in the world where they look at you as though you're an alien with 2 heads, and they've never seen anything like it in their lives before. So yeah, this place has had tourists before, and it was no big deal. We didn't have to be back on the boat until 10, but by 9, the little kid was getting tired and a bit grumpy, and so we all strolled back to the boat around about 9 o'clock and went back on board. And the next morning very early, we arrived at our destination. And this location is where the 3 borders come together, Peru, Colombia and Brazil. But first, we all jumped in a boat and it took us to the island of Santa Rosa, which is an island to get stamped out of Peru where the immigration office is. And then from there, Ben and his girlfriend will get a boat across to Leticia. I'll just get a boat across a small section of river to Tabatinga to go and find the immigration office there. But when we got on the island, it was like 6 o'clock in the morning. It was chilly and slightly misty, but you could see it's going to turn into a nice day. And there was a plaque on the immigration office door saying they didn't open till 9 o'clock. So we walked around a bit looking for a cafe, somewhere we can have some coffee and some breakfast. But nothing. It was far too early and nobody really cared. And it wasn't until about 8 o'clock when a woman with a cafe was kindly made us some coffee. She wasn't going to open for a few more hours, but she made us coffee. And even Ben got some fruit, I think, and his girlfriend got toast, something. I just went with the coffee. And while we sat there in the quiet, still morning air, I saw a pair of brightly coloured macaw parrots land in a nearby tree. Ben and his girlfriend didn't see it because they were eating, but and they were brilliantly coloured, totally wild. And I'm not sure, but I think they pair for life. Once again, not the big things. It's just those small things I yearn for when I travel. Like seeing the dolphins or giant otters. Well, it got to 9 o'clock and we were waiting outside the immigration office doors when the immigration officer turned up. Ben and the girlfriend went first, but Ben couldn't find his piece of paper with his entry and exit slip. The Peruvian immigration officer was strict, and she was just doing her job. When you go into countries like Bolivia, lots of countries in the world, but especially Bolivia is a very strict one, and Peru, if you don't have paper that you get when you come in, they just assume you came in illegally. what you do is you never lose this. You keep it safer than your passport, because a fine can be $25 or more in a country where people are poor. And he was worried about having to pay a heavy fine. But they both went through each other's papers, and I kept making suggestions. And eventually Ben found it. And with a sigh of relief, it was good. He didn't have to pay the fine. The immigration officer smiled. She was okay. When I sat down to have my papers checked and everything else and stamped out of Peru, she said, how much she enjoys the English because they're punctual, all this sort of stuff. I said, really, and they're polite and well behaved. So I just laughed. I said, yeah, sometimes. But, yeah, she was. I don't know if she was flirting with me or not. I'm not quite sure, but she stamped me out. It was very nice. She was very nice, and we were allowed to go. And she even gave us a smile as we left and said goodbye. So outside, we said our goodbyes and said we'd keep in touch and parted company. And Ben and his girlfriend went off to get a boat across to Leticia, and I found myself a skiff that would take me to Tabatinga. And as soon as I stepped ashore, I sensed the atmosphere was tense. In fact, I'd go more than that. I'd say that the atmosphere was not just tense, but it was hostile. And the shanty town around the port there was rough. And it felt seriously dodgy. And that, coming from me, that says something. Now, all I needed was to find the next immigration office, which wasn't proving to be easy. But I didn't know it then, but this next leg into Brazil was going to be a lot more aggro and a lot more hassle, especially with the ever-present gun-toting paramilitary that were always around. So tune in next week to hear me recount the next leg of the journey into Brazil along the great Amazon River.
Hi folks, this is Alan. If you listen and like these podcasts, please consider making a small donation to keep these podcasts alive. Unfortunately, at the moment, I have no other means of generating an income, and I do really enjoy making these recordings for you. If you are like me, struggling to make ends meet, and you can't afford to make a small donation, then please simply press like and subscribe and recommend this podcast to a friend. That would be a tremendous help. And thanks for taking the time to listen. I really do appreciate it. And I will put the link in the description below. Thank you.